So as long as I can remember, I've just wanted to learn as many things as I possibly could. From a child to today, I was just poring over encyclopedias, going to the library as often as I could. I spent a lot of time on my family's first computer. And then also, some of you may know this already, but I was actually homeschooled for part of my education. And at one point by choice, because I felt like traditional schooling would be an obstacle to my ability to learn as many things as I wanted to learn. So, with that background in mind, as I'm doing my morning readings, the various articles that I might read in the morning before I start my day properly, I was going through Cultural Tutors, Areopagus, volume 106. And I really enjoy Cultural Tutor, by the way, so big up to them. And in this particular volume, he shared a parable that I thought quite relevant. So it's a section on rhetoric, and he says, quote, "The wisdom literature of all the nooks and ages of the world has lots in common. Regular observations on universal flaws or features of the human condition reoccur across monotheistic, polytheistic, ancient, and modern religions and mythologies. One of these recurrent themes is the difficulty of speech, not the art of rhetoric itself or the necessity and use of becoming skillful in speech. Rather, I mean the more troubling matter of when and when not to speak, of when to ask questions and when not to, of when to answer or even refuse to answer. It has been said we live in a time of informational overload. The internet is ubiquitous, essentially infinite, and brutally addictive. We want and think we need to know so many things. We are Googling all the time, and now we are asking various incarnations of AI 1,000,000,000 questions every minute of the day. Well, I'm not, but but we must be careful. Our ancestors can help. And so this kind of speaks to what I've been saying about, just wanting to have all my questions answered, to know as much about the world as possible. But how much can we know? If we had no limits of time or effort, it wouldn't matter what we ask. We'd have time to ask every single possible question and follow-up question until everything we needed or wanted to know had been revealed and we understood it all. But we do have limits of both time and effort. Ergo, we cannot ask everything. As someone who makes learning about things and sharing what I've learned practically my living, it is a difficulty that I think about all the time. I have a huge stack of books that I would like to read that I want to get around to, fiction. I barely even get around to fiction these days because of the amount of non-fiction that I have to read and the mental toll that it takes. And I have this lengthy list of ideas for various video topics and essays and books and so on. And I just don't have time. I have to pick and choose what I want to direct my attention or my focus to. I don't always pick and choose correctly. I mean, I'm as much a victim as anyone else to the draw of the scroll from time to time. But I really want to be thoughtful about how I go about learning things, what I prioritize. And for me, I've chosen what my priorities are in any particular moment. And then I also get people in the audience who are like, oh, can you please talk about this? Or I have a question about this. Or what can you tell us about this? It's very easy to get distracted. But I'm trying to stay congruent and focus on the questions that I'm interested in and how I can go about finding those answers for others who also share that interest in those questions. To say less and listen instead is usually best. Just quoting a 10th century wisdom poetry. Cool. The great Thomas A. Kempis, quoted before in the Areopagus and frequently in my book, had much to say here. He was a 15th century Dutch priest who wrote a kind of spiritual guidebook called The Imitation of Christ. Throughout, he repeatedly warns against the danger of unnecessary questions, of questions that distract us from what is actually useful and meaningful in life. It's interesting to me that this is coming from a Christian scholar. I don't know what Cultural Tutor's particular religious background is, if any, but when I was a Christian, the quote-unquote danger of questions was implicitly understood. I remember scrolling through YouTube as a child and I saw a thumbnail for I think it was like a Dark Matter 2525 video or something like that. And it was kind of addressing one of the questions that had long occupied the back of my mind. But it felt like a thought crime to even consider clicking on the video, to even consider hearing it out. There are certain questions that were sacrilege. They may not have used that particular medieval sounding language, but it was kind of understood. It's like, yo, that's not the kind of questions you're supposed to be asking. You're supposed to be asking about the fruit of the spirit, not why a sacrifice needed to take place at all, all that kind of theological debate, at least in the environment that I grew up in. Some of this was meant in a very particular historical context. Thomas à Kempis rejected the triflingly complex, altogether pedantic theological and ecclesiological disputes that defined the Middle Ages and seemed in his time to be doing more harm than good for the Catholic Church. I want to say the more harm the better to the Catholic Church, but let's not go there. What I will say though is, I know in that time they were having all kinds of debates about, oh, what is the Trinity? What counts as the Trinity? Does the Trinity mean that Christianity is polytheistic? What is the hierarchy within the Trinity, or are they all equal? A lot of debates were happening at that point in time. But he urges us to pursue what is obviously and actually worth knowing. Our own judgment and feelings often deceive us, and we discern but little of the truth. He urges us to pursue what is obviously and actually worth knowing. And this is where we get into the meat and potatoes, the parable told by the Buddha that I wanted to share to kind of broach this topic in the first place. I read this and I was like, oh, I have to talk about this. Suppose a man was struck by an arrow thickly smeared with poison. His friends and colleagues, relative and kin, would get a surgeon to treat him. But the man would say, I won't extract this arrow as long as I don't know whether the man who wounded me was an aristocrat, a Brahmin, a peasant, or a menial. He'd say, I won't extract this arrow as long as I don't know the following things about the man who wounded me. His name and clan, whether he's tall, short, or medium, whether his skin is black, brown, or dingy, and what village, town, or city he comes from. I won't extract this arrow as long as I don't know whether the bow that wounded me was straight or recurved, whether the bowstring is made of swallowwort fiber, sun hemp fiber, sinew, sansevieria fiber, or spurge fiber. Whether the shaft is made from a bush or a plantation tree, whether the shaft was fitted with feathers from a vulture, a heron, a hawk, a peacock, or a stork, whether the shaft was bound with sinews of a cow, a buffalo, a black lion, or an ape, and whether the arrowhead was spiked, razor-tipped, barbed, made of iron, or a calf's tooth, or lancet-shaped. That man would still not have learned these things, and meanwhile, he'd die. Low-key, this whole parable reminded me of some of the minutiae-focused debates that are often had by those who are critical of the status quo. Now, I'm not an anti-intellectual. I don't necessarily dismiss the value of learning the specifics of the systems we operate under, the specific laws, the specific technologies, the specific individuals, the specific corporations. All those specifics can be useful to study, to learn about. There's the ebbs and flows of history. They're good to know. I don't deny that, but I often feel like, all right, but how much of learning these specifics are actually helping us to overcome them, you know? It reminds me of the people who really obsess and pore over conspiracies. At a certain point, you have to accept some things about the machinations of the system that you're not going to know. And you can spend all your time seeking those answers and die, as seen in the parable. Just because we can know something doesn't mean we should spend our time trying to know it. Not all knowledge is equally valuable in the hunt for emotional contentment, spiritual peace, and intellectual satisfaction. Time is precious. Now, as a radical, as an anarchist, I'm not solely seeking emotional contentment, spiritual peace, and intellectual satisfaction. I'm seeking social change. I'm seeking structural change. I'm seeking social revolution. So I'm not necessarily sharing this conclusion that those ends are all we should focus on in the pursuit of knowledge. But I do think it is important to ask, what are the questions that we should be asking, you know? And the Buddhist scripture offers 4 ways of asking questions. A question that should be answered categorically, a question should be answered analytically, a question should be answered with a counter question, and a question that should be set aside. The internet contains many things, but most of what it contains will do us no good. Our ancestors from all corners of the earth knew this, and would be wise to heed their wisdom when the false promise of unbounded knowledge is more alluring, more readily available than ever before. So my takeaway from that more so has to do with prioritizing what knowledges you seek. I'm concerned about the potentially religion-derived conclusion that you don't ask certain questions. I'm skeptical of that, and so I'm not taking that away from this. But I do believe we should be paying attention to what are and aren't the questions we should be asking. And so the questions that I prioritize, the questions that I seek to find the answers to, that is the focus of my channel, right? I'm trying to sort out my thoughts. I'm trying to use this medium, use the written word and video to better understand my own ideas and to share what I've learned with others. And necessarily that's going to mean that I focus on certain things. And if there is something that I don't know about and that I'm not interested in spending a lot of attention and time to learn about, I would hope that the people who do know that are willing to adopt a framework of intellectual generosity. So I got the concept of intellectual generosity from Wendy Fanuel Mwindi, who runs solutions for postmodern living. Since reading this article, it's really informed the way that I engage with the people that I associate with, organize with, engage in dialogue with, both in terms of how I treat the things that I have learned and how I deliver that to other people, but also how I expect them to treat me with the knowledge that they have. And the approach is one not of out reading, but rather one for reading in. So he makes four statements here. One, a statement often uttered by intellectuals. Well, first you have to read before you can say anything about blank. This kind of statement, and many others like it, serve to make the intellectual appear exclusive, part of an in-group composed of persons in the know. It is a statement of an intellectual who, consciously or unconsciously, derives satisfaction from out-reading others, leaving them behind in a cloud of dust. I have little patience for such intellectuals. They are misers, or, to be more precise, mere academic intellectuals. So I agree and I disagree. I agree that for some people there can be that kind of intellectual superiority complex at play. I disagree that you can project that motivation on everyone and say, oh, well, if they're not consciously, then they must be unconsciously thinking in that way. I agree that statements like, oh, you have to read this before you could say anything. I agree that that's like a messed up way of approaching people and approaching dialogue. However, I do also hold to some variation of, if you have not investigated a topic, if you have not learned about a topic, you probably should not be speaking over people on that topic. So it could be that we're thinking of different situations, but I'm thinking of the situations where people are just loud and wrong and anti-intellectual, and they don't care to be corrected, they don't care to be educated about where they may have gone wrong, but they just want to speak. I'm not a fan of that. I'm not fond of that. I think we do to some extent have to accept that, yeah, if people have put in the work to understand something, then you can't just pull up with your status quo derived preconceived notions, your quote unquote common sense, and act as though it overrides or carries the same currency, the same weight as those who have done that work. However, let's proceed, because the concept of intellectual generosity goes beyond this first point. As a counterfoil to academic intellectuals, I want to make the case for magnanimous intellectuals who read in others instead of out-reading others. The magnanimous intellectual, recognizing that a text holds knowledge another person might need, integrates that knowledge into their conversations and correspondence. In other words, the magnanimous intellectual, one who transcends mere academic posturing, finds ways to impart knowledge directly, generously sharing insights rather than hoarding them. If you're certain that a text offers knowledge someone else needs, it is because you have already acquired that knowledge yourself. Therefore, you can provide that knowledge directly without imposing the text on the other person. This, of course, requires effort on your part to explain and contextualize, but generosity often demands shouldering burdens for others when you are able. A few key words and phrases there. Reading in others instead of out-reading others. That's beautiful. That's beautiful to me. Integrated knowledge into your conversations and correspondence. I agree. And so when I'm writing my scripts and I'm pouring over texts and I'm pulling out highlights and I'm condensing them and synthesizing them, it's through that process that I better understand those ideas and better able to deliver those ideas in the script and then later on in correspondence, in dialogue. And that's why I recommend that whenever people are reading stuff, whether it be articles, books, whatever, take notes. Take notes, but don't just take notes of everything, take like intentional notes. It helps if you have like a pen and paper, pencil and paper, because it allows you to focus on the particularly relevant and important elements of the information, and that, I think, helps your brain to process it and to prioritize which elements are most valuable. I don't agree with the sentiment that if you are certain that a text offers knowledge someone else needs, it is because you have already acquired that knowledge yourself. Therefore, you can provide that knowledge directly without imposing the text on the other person. I don't think you can make that leap in all cases. I agree with the sentiment, but I don't think that that leap can be made in all cases. Like, I can recommend a book to someone without having fully processed it and digested it myself, and still recognize that that book is useful, and still recommend that book. I wouldn't necessarily frame it as imposing the text on the person without necessarily being able to communicate all the information in the book. I mean, dialogue and the written word are two very different formats. You know, so I could be in conversation with somebody, and yes, I can communicate insights, elements of the text, but it's an entirely different psychological experience to read that text yourself, to glean its insight yourself. Because if I'm sharing what I got from the text, remember, I'm going back to like my own experiences, my own context, my own value system. All of that is going to shape what I prioritize, what I value in the text, what aspects of the text I would communicate to you. And I think that, you know, if that's all that's needed in that particular moment, then sure. But if someone wants to get the most that they can get out of a text, yes, dialogue with others about the text is important, is valuable, does unlock sides of the text that a singular reading may not. But I still think that singular reading is important. 3. The magnanimous intellectual doesn't outread others, but instead reads ahead for others, then backtracks to read them in. They offer others the intelligence they need to determine what they might choose to read for themselves. If the magnanimous intellectual feels uncertain about their ability to convey the knowledge a text contains, they cannot confidently assert that the text provides any useful knowledge at all. In such cases, the magnanimous intellectual's only recourse is to offer to read the text alongside the other person. So when I'm associating with others, I do agree with the sentiment that you backtrack and that you share what it is you're learning as you're learning it. And this particular statement, they offer others the intelligence they need to determine what they might choose to read for themselves. That gets to what I was saying before, that you can still share your insights and through that potentially encourage the person to get into that text for themselves later on. Finally, 4. Magnanimous intellectuals do not demand silence from others until they have read the book on a topic. Instead, they engage in conversation or correspondence to share the knowledge they've gained from the book, offer to read the book alongside others, patiently listen to others, or withdraw from the conversation altogether. Options 3 and 4 are critical. Patiently listen to others or withdraw from the conversation altogether. A magnanimous intellectual listens patiently before imparting knowledge, especially when they suspect that the other person might misuse the knowledge a text provides. If the other person explicitly expresses intents to abuse such knowledge, the magnanimous intellectual must withdraw from the exchange entirely. And I don't think that's the only instance where you need to withdraw, because I don't think that the obligations of the magnanimous intellectual, of intellectual generosity, extends to every single internet stranger trying to start something. I think it applies in the context of relationships. Some basis of commonality, some shared affinity, even where there may be different and diametric opposition in other respects. You know, I'm not going to painstakingly, point by point, go through an argument with an internet random. I will painstakingly and patiently engage in an exchange with someone that I know, someone that I am working with, somebody that I see value in connecting with for practical and fruitful ends. But some internet stranger from Northampton or Ohio or whatever, I don't need to go back and forth with them. You have to pick your battles. But getting back to the whole conversation around knowing things, one of the questions that I consider worth asking, to go back to that Buddhist parable and that cultural tutor conversation, is the question of whether truth is ever knowable. I think it's hard to pin down. And as I'm meditating on these thoughts, I come across this article by Pauline on synthesis, because, you know, I'm in my anarchist without adjectives, synthesis anarchist bag right now. And Pauline was like one of the instrumental thinkers in this kind of approach, right? This is Pauline here. And so in On Synthesis, Pauline is engaging with the question of what is truth. 3 principal obstacles arise along the path we follow to seek and establish objective truth, no matter in what direction or in what region we hope to find it. The first of these obstacles is expressed with a purely theoretical and philosophical character. In fact, the truth is the great existing all, everything that exists in reality. To know the truth means to know what is. But to know what is, to know the veritable truth, the essence of things, things in themselves would appear to be, for several reasons, impossible at this time. And perhaps it will always be so. The essential reason for that impossibility is the following. The world would never be for us anything but the idea that we fashion of it. It presents itself to us not as it is in reality, but as is depicted to us by our or more poor, false senses, and by our incomplete and crude methods of knowing things. Both are very limited, subjective, and fickle. The second obstacle, like life, truth is undivided. Truth, like life, is the great all. To know this or that part of the truth still cannot mean that we know the truth, although it is sometimes necessary to go from knowledge of the parts to the knowledge of the whole. To know the truth, this means to be precise, to know all the universe in its entirety, all of existence, all of life, all the paths of life, as well as all its forces, all its laws and tendencies, for all times and all terms, in all its different secrets, in all its phenomena and separate details, as well as in its entirety. Now, even if it was only within the limits of the world intelligible to our faculties of impression and understanding, to embrace the universe, to know life and penetrate its inner meaning, appears to us impossible at present, and perhaps it will never be possible. Third obstacle. The most characteristic trait of life is its eternal and uninterrupted movement, its changes, its continual transformations. Thus there exists no firm, constant, and determined truth. Or rather, if there exists a general, complete truth, its defining quality would be an incessant movement of transformation, a continual displacement of all the elements of which it is composed. And so it's with these obstacles in mind that we proceed. To know the truth, that means to know life as it is, to know the true essence of things. We do not know that true life, so we do not know the truth. However, we possess some knowledge of it. As we receive impressions of life and we learn to know it through the testimony of our senses and through the means of knowing that we find at our disposal, precisely as we run up against the obstacles indicated, we learn first that life is some great synthesis, as reality as well as personal feeling, some resultant of a quantity of diverse forces and energies, of factors of all sort. We also learn that this synthesis is subject to a continuous movement, to incessant vibrations, to incessant variations. We know that that resultant is never found at rest, but that on the contrary, it oscillates and varies without ceasing. To know the truth, that would mean to embrace, know, and understand the whole of this global synthesis in all of its details, in all its entirety, and in all its eternal movement, in all its combinations and its uninterrupted variations. If we know life in its details, in its entirety, and in its movements, we will know the truth. And that truth will be the resultant, constantly in movement, of a quantity of forces, a resultant of which we should also know all the movements. We know neither the true life nor its synthesis. We know neither its reality nor its meaning nor its movements. For us, life in its entirety is the great enigma, the great mystery. We only manage from time to time to pluck some fragment of its synthesis from the air. It often happens that we succeed in drawing the exact assessment from some phenomenon, and that consequently we manage to put our finger on a coin, on a part, on a fragment of the truth. 4 fundamental errors are very frequent and very characteristic in these cases. 1. Human analysis is not infallible. It does not lead directly to the exact and indubitable absolute truth. In every analysis, in every human research, we inevitably encounter, along with some scraps of truth grasped on the spot, more or less great errors, lapses, sometimes oversights, and clumsy false judgments. Thus, we make assertions not in conformity with the truth. We generally forget that this is the case, and instead of seeking to establish and to eliminate these errors, to find and apply the necessary corrections, we disregard them, or else we do still worse. We consider our errors as an expression of the truth, so that we disfigure it and distort its value. 2. Save for very rare exceptions, we are generally inclined to exaggerate the significance, sometimes very minuscule, of the bit of truth found by us, to generalize it, to make of it the whole truth, to extend it, if not to life in its entirety, at least to phenomena of much larger and more complicated order, and at the same time to reject other elements of the truth we seek. 3. We let ourselves be carried away by the analysis and the generalization, erroneous from its immediate results. We constantly forget to consider the second moment, and that is the most essential one, necessary to the search for the truth, of the true and accurate way of generalization, of the necessity the analysis once made, and a phenomenon, a fragment of truth grasped and understood, not to take hold of that bit and raise it to the rank of keystone by making it the entire truth, but on the contrary, to remember other phenomena relating to the same order of ideas, to seek to fathom their meaning as well, to compare them with the bit of truth discovered, and to do everything in order to establish a correct synthesis. This problem of the second degree generally escapes us. We forget that life is a synthesis of a great number of factors. 4. We forget at each step that movement and variability never cease. We forget that there exists no apathetic truth, that in life everything flows, that life and truth are the dynamics par excellence. Habitually, we do not account for this factor of an extreme importance and value, the uninterrupted dynamism of life and truth. However, just as it would be erroneous to take the form adopted at a certain moment by an amoeba in motion for its constant form, it would be a mistake to suppose a similar rigidity in the essence of truth. What has just been, or what could have been truth a moment ago, is not longer truth in the following moment. The synthesis itself is not immutable. It is only a resultant constantly in motion, which sometimes comes closer to one of the factors and sometimes to another, and never remains close to one or the other for long. We do not take sufficient account of this singularly important fact. And so Verlaine goes on from there to speak about how this harmful approach emerges in the domain of the human sciences. It is precisely in this domain that the most serious errors most often take place. It is especially the numerous followers of the seekers of truth who are guilty of this. The mission to re-examine their truths, to redress their errors and make the necessary corrections, later falls to others. Then Verlaine uses the examples of Marx and Engels' approach to the role of the economic factor in history. He speaks of the theory of classes of Karl Marx and his followers. He speaks of the law of the struggle for existence, referencing Charles Darwin. And he speaks of the unilateral individualist theory of Max Stirner, especially of his followers. The economic doctrine of Marx and his theory of classes, the individualist conception of Stirner, as well as the law of the struggle for existence to Darwin, etc., etc., are always admirable analyses, well directed and called to give some important results, of one of the factors, of one of the elements of the complicated and vital synthesis. But in order to approach the truth of the synthesis, all these theories are lacking one essential thing: the understanding of the necessity of juxtaposing them with the analysis of other elements and other factors, with the deductions that can be made from the results of these other analyses. They lack the aspiration to seek the synthesis. We lose sight of the real and moving synthetic nature of life and the necessity of a corresponding synthetic character in scientific knowledge. This is the source of the errors of generalization and deduction. Instead of approaching the truth, we distance ourselves from it. And so my approach to learning has been and continues to be to seek that synthesis, to never lock myself in a particular theory or framework that prevents me from engaging entirely with other analyses, even as I see flaws in them. It is very probable that we will never attain the knowledge of a correct and complete synthesis, but the principle that must guide us is a constant effort to approach it to the greatest extent possible. Each time that we close our eyes to the defects and vices of the bits of truth found by us, we distance ourselves from the result sought. The proper method consists, on the contrary, to carefully account for these errors and of seeking their correction. As far as this applies to the pursuit of knowledge in relation to social revolution, to anarchist social revolution, I appreciated this line that I am not an enemy of syndicalism, I only speak out against its megalomania. I'm not an enemy of communism, I only speak out against all sectarian narrowness of views and intolerance. I'm not an enemy of individualism, I only speak out against its egocentric blindness. I'm not an enemy of the moral perfection of the self, but I do not accept it to be recognized as the unique means. I'm not an enemy of organization, and this is the most crucial one. I am not an enemy of organization, but I do not want anyone to make a cage of it. Going back to the questions that we have to ask about which questions are worth asking, what forces will bring about the social revolution, especially these immense creative tasks, and how? What will be the essence, character, and forms of this whole magnificent process? If you're interested in that question, in those questions, you'll probably be interested in the kind of work that I do. And it's fascinating to me that Verlaine was saying this stuff and raising these questions and making these points all the way back in 1924, over 100 years ago. And here I am over 100 years later, meditating on this text, relating it to the work that I've been doing, and finding resonance. So Valine spends a lot of time talking about the whole truth, the unknowability of the entirety of truth, what I would consider the chaos of reality. It had me thinking about the challenge in communication to find a common definition. Because words and their meanings, they're in contention. They live in contested spaces. We are constantly reframing, reappropriating, redefining the words that we use according to our context, according to our aims. And so the best that we can do, I think, is to strive for clarity and to define things at the outset of our works and exchanges. And so that's what I try to do when I'm writing videos, especially when it comes to these broad topics. If you pay attention and you watch all of my videos between like 2024 and 2026, really since the beginning of the channel though, you'll notice that I've been refining how I define key concepts in my work, trying to update my definitions as my understanding deepens. And I found that this recent translation of a work by Pierre Joseph Proudhon, translated thanks to Sean Wilbur, was particularly timely and relevant. This is where he's engaging with indefinition. By the way, I'm going to link all the particular texts that I'm referencing in the description. He approaches, among other subjects, the problem of definition. So he says that every definition is in the mind before being in words. The spoken definition can be more or less fortunate in its expression. If the known definition is exact, the first will do. It serves no other purpose than to call the attention to a pure and a priori conception of the understanding. Let us explain this, for example. The straight line is the shortest path from one point to another. Is that a definition? One can contest it. And yet, however, that general definition is sufficient. One does not risk ever going astray by adopting it. Why? Because in reality, it is not the words that define, it is the mind that, on hearing words, knows immediately the thing as defined. As soon as we hear the words, although the words do not say everything and sometimes say it badly, the idea is given. The mind itself defines it. So I'm going to continue to try and refine my definitions and make things as plain as I can to continue to seek knowledge and to communicate that knowledge to the extent that I'm able, and to accept that the difficulties of communication, the difficulties of knowing, the difficulties of asking questions, all of these will continue to be grappled with until the end of time. With all that said, good luck to everyone communicating to everyone else. And yeah, I hope you all enjoyed my scattered but semi-organized thoughts on this topic. Let me know if you all want to see more of these kind of disjointed rambles mixed with lengthy quotations.